Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Small Size, Big Plans, Product Development Advice for Small Companies, presented by Rowe. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor for Fierce Markets, and I'll be your moderator. Our speakers today are David Shoemaker, PhD and Senior Vice President of Research and Development at Rowe, Lauren Neighbors, PhD, RAC, a Research Scientist at Rowe, and Shayla Bello-Irizarry, PhD, RAC, Integrated Product Development Associate at Rowe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen. And you can submit questions during the presentation. That pretty much covers it. I think we're ready to begin. David, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Joe. So the agenda today is going to work sort of like this. I'm going to give a 30,000-foot overview of the environment that we're in currently in the pharmaceutical industry, then spend a fair amount of time talking about our team that we recommend you use for developing products. And then Lauren and Shayla are going to go into some more detail, primarily about the target product profile and the integrated product development plan, as well as other aspects that contribute to both of those documents. So for introduction purposes, I think everyone's aware that the drug development industry is evolving very rapidly, and that more and more small biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies are popping up just about everywhere you look. The large pharmaceutical companies are still tending to merge and grow and become more marketing and sales companies than pharmaceutical companies. So they're tending to buy up technologies that are developed by small companies rather than invest in the basic research and development. So it's a changing landscape, and consequently, more and more responsibility is being given to the small biotech and pharma companies, and it requires those employees to be very knowledgeable about the development process. If they came from academia or government, chances are they have to do a lot of learning before they can assist their companies optimally. And I think it's important to focus on getting a product to market rather than just getting a product into humans, as many naive small companies do. They think getting into humans is the big step, when in fact, if you haven't done it correctly with the right data, that's not of much value to a potential partner or a venture capital firm that's going to invest. The next aspect is focusing on the data at the pre-IND stage. So your pharmacology results cannot just consist of one published paper, in as much as 70% of the published literature is irreproducible these days. And that may be due to not understanding how the experiments were done sufficiently from the article, or it may be done from sloppy work. You can't really tell, but it's important that these published studies be validated in your own company before you move forward. Also, when you're conducting these initial pharmacology studies, it's important to at least examine to some extent the safety of your product around the important physiological systems like CNS, cardiovascular, respiratory system. You can head off a development program pretty quickly by identifying safety issues before you ever get to your tox program. It's important to identify the clinical indication early on, and that requires mandatory input by a physician and also surveying key opinion leaders around the world who would weigh in on how this product is going to be used in the market. And to help with that, certainly developing a commercial strategy and a reimbursement strategy at an early stage lends credence to your overall program. The next slide is just simply a diagram of all the activities that are taking place from discovery through product development to marketing approval. And I understand many companies think it's premature to consider what's happening at the post-approval stage in commercialization, but I can assure you that if you don't understand that to the 50% level, you're going to go down dead ends. And as you can see, there's a lot of activities. Each one of those is a potential dead end if you don't develop your product consistently with the ultimate target. And then lastly, I'll talk about what sort of team that you need to develop your products. First and foremost, you need a CEO who is experienced in getting products to market. If you have a brand spanking new CEO or a CEO that has, driven 4 biotech companies into the ground, that's not an optimal situation. Your CEO should know how to raise enough money to be able to fund the program. And they should be aware of how much it's going to take to get a product to market. Going out with a team with an inadequate CEO is like wasting everybody's time. In addition to the CEO, though, there are some critical positions that we would like to emphasize. One, the regulatory project manager who ideally has gotten products to market and understands all the different disciplines and how they interact with one another so that a reasonable and realistic plan can be laid out for all the different disciplines. This is essential. Obviously, a statistical scientist is called upon very frequently for most clinical studies and can contribute on the non-clinical and in the CMC arena as well. As I said earlier, a therapeutic medical expert is absolutely required in designing your clinical development plan, and more than likely you'll need to access key opinion leaders for logistical considerations. All of these people must have taken a product to market previously, or you're betting on the wrong horse. A commercialization expert is also imperative, and a CMC scientist is probably the most important, because most products go on clinical hold or fail to be approved at the marketing application stage because of a CMC deficiency. We see products all the time that absolutely should be on the market, but they fail for some CMC shortcut that is taken or some error that is not anticipated. You can also bring team members on in a targeted fashion, and that's what the right-hand column is on this slide, with a health economics expert, IP attorney, clinical pharmacologist, non-clinical pharmacologist, and toxicology scientist. All of these people are needed for your program, but they will not be required in as an extensive fashion as the individuals on the left-hand side of the table. I also want to talk about the scientific advisory board. People are very interested in having former or current Nobel laureates on their scientific advisory board, and that's all well and good, and that can assist in raising funds. But if your scientific advisory board has never worked with products that have made it to market, you're hog-tying your hands on your development team. These people should be contributing not just for their scientific expertise, but also their development expertise. So with that, I will stop with the 30,000-foot view and turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks, David. Okay, so once you have your team assembled, as David just outlined, you then need to begin outlining your product development strategy by thinking with the end in mind, as David had alluded to previously, with the end typically being market approval of the product. By focusing first on where you want to end up, including target product labeling claims, as well as the efficacy and safety data that will be needed for marketing approval, you can then determine the most efficient pathway to achieve your end goal and work backwards to plan your overall development pathway. So as in this slide, if we start first with market approval, we can then outline the ideal phase 3 study or studies in the target patient population, which is the population that you intend to treat with your product once your product is approved. After designing the phase 3 studies, you should then outline the early phase studies necessary to establish the initial safety and proof of concept data that are needed before embarking on an expensive phase 3 program. Finally, you can then identify what data are needed to file either or both an investigational new drug application or IND, or a clinical trial authorization or CTA, depending on your target countries for marketing. And then you should design the non-clinical and CMC studies that will be needed to be conducted before being able to enter the clinic. And so in order to effectively organize your development strategy, we recommend that you take advantage of some of the strategic product development tools that are focused on the end goal of product labeling and marketing. And then in the next few slides, we'll discuss how the target product profile, also referred to as the TPP, and the integrated product development plan, or IPDP, can be developed and effectively maintained throughout the life cycle of the product. Okay, so starting first with the TPP. What is a TPP, or target product profile? The TPP is a key strategic planning document. It provides clear understanding of specific product development requirements, as well as expectations for your product development, and is driven by patient, physician, and payer needs for marketing. One of the aspects of the TPP is that it communicates a differentiated value proposition for your product. What is the overall intent of your product development plan and your program? What makes you different and better than what's currently available on the market? It's important to keep in mind that the TPP is a living document that should be used throughout your development program as a roadmap that outlines key no-go and go decision points throughout the journey. Go, no-go decision points are specific, pre-specified pivot points for your program that remind you to pause and review the status of your development program before determining whether to move forward to the next phase of development. The TPP should also include a summary of studies that justify your target labeling claims. You should focus the development of your product only on the studies that will be required for product labeling, no more and no less. The TPP is a dynamic and multidisciplinary document that should be constantly revisited and updated throughout your development program. That's important. Once you draft the TPP, you're not done. It needs to continuously be reviewed by a multidisciplinary team. Each time you obtain new information, and that includes new data from the studies you've conducted, but it also includes information from changes observed in the market. Importantly, the TPP can be used as an effective communication tool, not just for your internal product development team, but it can also be used for communication with external parties, including potential investors, as well as regulatory authorities. For this reason, it can be helpful to have more than one version of the TPP, depending on the audience with which you wish to share. It should also be developed and reviewed by the multidisciplinary team that David had mentioned previously. And of course, as we alluded to, the TPP can and should be used as the starting point for your annotated package insert or product labeling. So this slide shows the draft FDA guidance for industry on the target product profile. It was released by FDA about 10 years ago in 2007, and it outlines the purpose of the TPP as just strategic and dynamic document that can be used throughout product development. It also encourages the use of the TPP as a communication tool with FDA. Some sponsors see the TPP only as an internal communication tool, but it can certainly be used and is encouraged to be used with FDA and other regulatory authorities. It can be included in your initial IND application, for example, or your pre-IND meeting package, even earlier than that. But it can also be included in the briefing packages that you develop with formal meetings with FDA throughout development. And so this slide includes a typical TPP checklist and several of the elements that are included in a TPP. Many of these sections correspond to sections within the annotated package insert, but it also includes information that's not included, typically in product labeling, including specific regulatory intelligence on your product, information on the market and the competitive landscape, your patent strategy, as well as other elements that are specific to your development strategy. We suggest organizing the information in a TPP template. If you don't already have a TPP template, the FDA guidance for industry that I mentioned in the previous slide includes an example TPP template in the appendices, which can be quite helpful to create your initial template. But there's also commercially available TPP templates that you can obtain. As I've mentioned a few times here, the TPP is a detailed development plan, and it needs to be maintained throughout your development program. Once you've developed a TPP for your pre-IND meeting package, for example, you're not done with it. You need to continue to revisit it and revise the TPP throughout your program. So every time you obtain new data that may impact your program, you should evaluate those data, determine whether to proceed with your current strategy or modify the strategy based on those pre-specified go, no-go decisions, and then revise the TPP in accordance with the new data and strategy and determine whether or not to move forward with that plan. Using the TPP to support your development pathway will help you guide your decisions in a more structured and strategic way. And so once you've drafted your TPP, you're then ready to create the Integrated Product Development Plan, or IPDP. Like the TPP, the IPDP is a strategic plan, but it covers all components of the drug development spectrum from a product in much more detail. It's a strategic and dynamic tool that specifies the goals, activities, and contingency plans for your development program. The IPDP takes information from the TPP, as well as specific details on the competitive landscape, market intelligence, and other regulatory information, and goes into much more detail on the specific clinical, non-clinical, and CMC activities that are needed to develop your product. And so when we look at a high level on the content that's included in the IPDP, you often have an introduction, high-level executive summary. You have elements that are directly from your target product profile that should be included in target labeling. The IPDP then goes into detail on what's included in your overall clinical development plan, non-clinical or preclinical development, as well as CMC plan and specific activities that underlie each of those plans. And then should also include information about regulatory history and landscape, as well as your overall development strategy. And so just to provide an example on how you can utilize information from the TPP to feed into the IPDP development, the next few slides illustrate the specific use of the TPP and how these elements interact. So one of the essential elements of the TPP is to define the target market for your product. And this should be expanded on in several aspects of your IPDP. Who is your market? How many patients will eventually be treated by your product? And what competitive products are currently available to treat this specific indication? Does the product treat a rare indication, and thus how cost-effective will it be for your company to develop the product based on the cost of development and the price at which you'd eventually need to charge for the product to make a profit? How will this impact the design of your clinical and non-clinical program, the differentiators that need to be considered to ensure your product can successfully be marketed upon product approval? And all of these elements will feed into the development of your clinical studies, non-clinical studies, CMC development, your regulatory strategy, as well as your marketing strategy. Additionally, the dosing regimen and route of administration also feed into the design of the clinical program, both in terms of how many patients will need to be dosed, at what frequency, but also impacts the CMC and non-clinical programs, including the formulation of the product, the qualification studies that need to be conducted for the specific route and duration of dosing. For example, either whether the dosing will be chronic or short-term acute dosing. It also impacts the species of animal that you need to choose for your non-clinical studies. So, for example, if your dosage form is a capsule, you may prefer or may be optimal to perform tox studies in dogs that can actually swallow capsules versus rats that won't be able to ingest that dosage form, for example. Another element of the TPP that impacts the IPDP is your dose strengths. So the different strengths of your product will impact the design of your clinical program that's outlined in the IPDP, the clinical pharmacology of your product, as well as the CMC development needs for each strength of the formulation, and your intended marketing strategy for all of those strengths as well. One of the essential elements of the TPP is defining the target indication and population for your product. And this also feeds into several important elements of the IPDP, including the design of the phase 2 and phase 3 clinical studies, which would typically be conducted in the target population, specific pharmacology and CMC considerations for this population. For example, if the target population has known food allergies, you need to make sure that the excipients in the formulation are not known allergens. Additionally, the safety and efficacy data needed to support your differentiated value proposition also impacts the design of your pivotal phase 3 studies, as well as the marketing strategy for your product, given you can only market to claims that will be supported by evidence as specified in your product labeling. The TPP should also outline the target or expected side effect profile of your product and how it compares with existing products on the market or other products in development as well. And this information will impact the clinical program and the design of your clinical studies to minimize potential side effects, but also to be able to identify safety signals that may be expected in this target population. And then finally, potential drug-drug interactions identified in the TPP, either based on other products in that class or others that you expect based on your early phase development, would also impact the design of the clinical program. For example, identifying which concomitant therapies may be prohibited during the study to prevent potentially harmful drug-induced effects, either to the patient or to your product. And they may also impact your marketing strategy and target product labeling. Expected safety issues should also be outlined in the TPP and also impact the clinical studies in your IPDP, as well as the analyses that may be needed for specific AEs of special interest, for example. A couple other items to consider, some common pitfalls that we often see with failure to either develop these strategic development plans or to use them effectively. First of all, one of the common issues that we see here is failing to seek interdisciplinary input on both the development of these plans, but also the maintenance of these plans from your cross-functional team members, and importantly from key stakeholders, including C-level executives. This can result in overlooking important aspects of your program that can lead to inefficiencies down the road, and in the worst-case scenario, it may end up derailing the program. An example is failing to bring in marketing representatives early on when you're identifying target labeling claims. The marketing team for your product will be responsible for creating the marketing strategy and advertising campaigns, and they need to be on board to effectively sell your product to the target market. Other issues that can arise that we see as well include a failure to sufficiently research and incorporate regulatory intelligence into your development plans, or a failure to address the competitive landscape and the impact it has on your development strategy. Additionally, a lack of go-no-go decision points, or if you've identified those go-no-go decisions but you fail to enforce them, this can lead to inefficiencies, and sometimes it may cause you to continue with a program that should be terminated because ultimately it won't be successful. Additionally, both the TPP and the IPDP are living strategic documents, and they should be used and maintained throughout planning, development, and communication with your team and with external parties. Failing to revisit these documents and update them on an ongoing basis can lead to problems and inefficiencies.
Yeah, and this is David again. I just want to emphasize that this is probably the number one error that we see in working with companies, is that even if they develop this plan, they don't use it as a tool to manage their program. Theoretically, this plan can be detailed enough to have every timeline and every budget item listed in it. You don't always have to go to that level of detail, but if you don't go to that level of detail, somebody has to be given the responsibility of staying up with everybody and coordinating with them on a fairly regular basis. Otherwise, as Lauren said, the inefficiencies start to outnumber the progress.
All right, so now we're going to turn things over to Shayla to go into more detail on product development planning for each of the disciplines within your program.
Thank you, Lauren. So first of all, we want to start talking about the different development plans, and keeping with the theme of beginning with the end in mind, the first development plan that you would like to develop is the clinical development plan. And you would like to know that the phase 3 studies are focused on efficacy and safety, and your indication and your population has to be very specific and established by this point. Importantly, the phase 2 studies are also called pivotal. These should be adequate and well-controlled studies, and they should be agreed with the FDA. It's important that you go and interact with the agency so there's agreement on the components of these clinical studies. You typically require at least 2 studies that are adequate and well-controlled, and definitely this is the major basis for your marketing approval. And the endpoints and all the data from these studies are going to be impacting your label. Now from that, once you know exactly what's your target, what are your endpoints, from the phase 2 studies, they're also focused on efficacy and safety, but they're typically proof of concept. This is where you typically start testing your product in your target population, and commonly these are dose range finding studies to be able to be used for the phase 3 study. And you can have plenty of exploratory endpoints and outcomes, and at this stage you would like to define which ones are effective for your phase 3, and you would like to consult with the FDA as well. Now for phase 1 studies, these are healthy, typically done in healthy volunteers, and it's definitely focused on safety. This is sometimes it's the first in-human study or SAD/MAD, single ascending dose or multiple ascending dose studies. And there's a lot of information you would like to obtain from the phase 1, for example, drug interactions, any QT cardiovascular effects, food effects of your drug, and viability. You need to understand all these prior to move on phase 3, but you want to start thinking with the end in mind. Now the non-clinical development plan, the goal is this is a comprehensive assessment of the pharmacology, the pharmacokinetics, and the toxicity of the drug substance and the drug product. And it's important that this will affect tremendously how the data are used for your clinical trials. And it will affect all the decisions around it. For example, it will impact the dose selection for your first clinical trial and the duration. And for example, if you have a drug that will it will be chronically used, you need to perform non-clinical studies to determine what's the safe duration of the studies then in humans. You will in the non-clinical development plan, you also specify information on the pharmacodynamics, the mechanism of action of your drug, and any biomarker development. Those also have to be specified in this plan. The therapeutic index, you need to understand that prior to going to your clinical studies. And importantly, you need to get some light on any specific safety monitoring that's needed for your clinical study. You're going to find those in your non-clinical studies. And You need to understand also any specific populations. For example, if you are you're planning to develop a drug for adult and pediatric populations, you need to also assess the safety in non-clinical juvenile animals, for example. All these items will be present in the label. And another important consideration is that some of these studies are performed under GLP conditions, good laboratory practices, so you need to plan accordingly for those and talk to any CMOs that you need to contract early on. Another important consideration is that biologics and small molecules are have different requirements, so you also need to consider those. Now for CMC, the Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls Plan, the goal of this development plan is to assure the proper identification, quality, purity, and strength of your drug product and your drug substance. You need to consider and describe the manufacture of your active pharmaceutical ingredient, your API, and you need to also describe in detail all the analytical assays and the validation of all these assays. You need to also describe your formulation or pre-formulation development and the manufacture of your clinical trial material. You need to include data related to the release testing, packaging of your clinical trial material, and also you need to also consider that if you have a placebo arm, that's part of your clinical trial material in addition to your active arm. Importantly, stability testing, it requires very important prior to your initial studies. And again, similar to the non-clinical development plan, the biologics and small molecules have different requirements, and you need to understand those early on so you don't have additional studies that are not needed, and you don't waste your resources. Now, for the regulatory strategy, this is a very important aspect that's why David and Lauren mentioned previously that you would like to have a project manager with regulatory expertise, because this person will help you navigate through the regulatory hurdles of your program. You need to understand what is the filing pathway for your drug or biologic. If you are developing a new chemical entity, not new molecular entity, you have to use a 505(b)(1) versus a 505(b)(2) pathway, which is for a new formulation, new indication, new route of administration for an already approved API. You also need to consider, if you're developing a drug-device combination, that you need to interact with different divisions in the agency. And each one of these pathways will determine what are the type of data required, and it will help you understand what are the regulatory hurdles. Now, another important consideration for your regulatory strategy is to understand your competition. You need to review the labels, the summary basis of approval for your competitors, your EPARs, which are the European Public Assessment Reports in Europe, and the financial reports. That will help you understand and provide you with some of the intelligence to help you determine what is your competitive advantage. Importantly, you need to understand what are the region-specific regulations, and that's why the ICH was formed. It's a conference, international conference of harmonization, to harmonize the technical requirements of the pharmaceuticals for human use. And even though this is harmonized in various countries, including Europe, USA, and Japan, but FDA in US and EMA in Europe also has very specific requirements, so you want to consult with them during your development program and as early as possible. Now, if you're developing a product that is intended to treat a rare disease, then there's specific consideration that you like to consider. For example, the orphan drug designation. And This designation is an incentive that provides benefits and some tax breaks, 7-year market exclusivity for companies who are developing drugs for rare diseases. And importantly, in the United States, this means that your disease has to affect less than 200,000 patients in the United States. So those are good considerations, and it will help you develop your product and save some costs during your program. There are also other accelerated mechanisms in the United States that you can take advantage of. For example, the Breakthrough Therapy Accelerated Approval Priority Review. Most of these programs are intended to treat for serious or life-threatening diseases. So it's important to distinguish that a rare disease doesn't necessarily mean life-threatening disease. So that's why these are described in separate guidelines by the FDA, and here we're also providing you with a link to the guidance to the expedited programs for the serious conditions. So it's important to understand your drug and take advantage of these programs if you can. Now, for the initial agency interaction opportunities that you have, it depends on the type of product that you're developing. So if you are developing a novel drug, you may want to consider a pre-IND meeting. These are not common, but this could be helpful if you're developing a drug with no precedence for any similar type of drug in the market, and you would like to consider and talk to the agency about your manufacturing and any toxicology questions that you may have. You want to have those answers really early.
And I just want to make a comment about pre-IND meetings. They're held principally when you have an opportunity to educate FDA about a therapeutic product that they have not seen before. That's really the reason that we recommend pre-IND meetings. If they've got experience with your product previously, you can probably get enough information to go for a pre-IND meeting from the industry experts that are out in the world.
Yes, thank you, David. Yes. But another most common type of meeting is the pre-IND meeting. We highly recommend that even if you have a very well-characterized product. You would like to obtain agency buy-in on your clinical protocol, your non-clinical safety studies, and your CMC program. And what is required for these meetings, you need to develop a briefing document. And ideally, this will come from your IPDP, your Integrated Product Development Plan, where you're going to summarize all of the plans, and you will provide enough information to the agency so they can understand your program and they are able to answer your questions. Importantly, the questions that you ask the agency should be very well written, and you don't want to have any open-ended questions. You need to have specific questions, yes or no type of questions to get agency buy-in on your plans. And ideally, that's something that we also recommend, is that you create your briefing document prior to requesting the meeting. Sometimes sponsors will just want to ask the questions, and then once you start developing your plans and putting everything together, then you have additional questions. So ideally, you will have that ready to go early on. And there are different agency interactions opportunities. Here we're listing some of the most common ones: pre-IND meeting, end of phase 1, end of phase 2 meeting. You present your data and your plans. You confirm your plans with the agency to get their buy-in on that. And very importantly, prior to your NDA or BLA submission, you would like to have a meeting with the agency. We're also here providing the guidance, a link to the guidance of the formal meetings between the FDA and sponsors. Now, in order to avoid delays, namely clinical holds after your IND submission, the most critical factors is that if you have a development plan that is not focused enough, those are doomed to lead to delays. So that's why we're emphasizing the TPP and the IITDP early on. That's going to help you tremendously. Now, it's good to put everything in perspective and know that the CDER receives approximately 1,500 IND submissions per year. So they're really busy, and you want to make sure that your IND submission is flawless. It has all the information they need to be able to help you clear the IND so you can start with your clinical program. We're also providing here, there was a recent report that showed that 9% of the INDs were placed on clinical hold, and the major reason for clinical hold was CMC issues, followed by clinical issues, followed by toxicology. So really you need to explain those in great detail when you talk to the agency. Now, these are some of the common reasons for clinical holds. First, poorly organized submission or insufficient information. You really want to avoid that. You don't want to delay your program because you don't have enough information in your IND. Inadequate information to assess safety. As David mentioned earlier, you need to understand how your drug affects cardiovascular, respiratory, and CNS organ systems, and sometimes that's missing. In terms of the clinical study design, sometimes some of the reasons the clinical hold is that the clinical study is too aggressive or lacks needed safety monitoring, or the dose-limiting toxicity is not well defined, the stopping rules are inadequate, or the inclusion-exclusion criteria are inadequate. So those are things that you need to consider early on and have all the stakeholders contribute to the protocol, and experienced team members for sure. Also, unqualified impurities and excipients in your clinical batch or poorly defined impurity profile. The drug product is not stable through the testing program, again, stability program, and that the NOAEL is not determining the no observable event level. You need to make sure that that is specified, quantified, and convert that to the human equivalent dose to be able to determine what is the safe maximum dose to start a clinical study. I want to go over just generally about patent protection. It's good to just have a general understanding of these issues early. The most important part that we want to emphasize here is that you need to hire an IP patent attorney early on, and this person will help you navigate the appropriateness of your claims, help you do some research on prior art, and help you get some exclusivity. So the reason you want to do this early is that the exclusivity will be granted only to the inventors that file first. So you want to file early. So there are different types of patents. The most notable and most common is the composition of matter patent or product patents, and this covers your API. There are also the patents, like, for example, the process patent that covers the manufacture of the API, formulation patent that covers the drug product or your dosage form, or the method of use patent that covers the use of the drug to treat a disease. Well, ideally, you would like to have multiple patents, but here we're also providing a link to an article to give you some ideas on the strategies that are typically used in the biopharmaceutical sciences. Now, in terms of partnership strategy, something that you're probably thinking about early on and is changing all the time. But importantly, you would like to have a viable financing strategy to fund your R&D projects and all your operations. And again, we're emphasizing you would like to hire a retainer seasoned management who already knows and has previous experience taking products to market. Now, importantly, you like to have a compelling scientific product. Need to understand what are your advantages, your competitive advantages, what makes your product better than other existing products in the market. And you need to secure IP technologies and business ideas to be able to interact with all your stakeholders, including potential investors. Now, there are different strategic alliances and business models that you will probably come across, and some of those include the licensing transactions, co-development agreements, joint ventures, or any other alliances. And additionally, it's important to understand any exit strategies. Ideally, you probably like to have to bring your product all the way to market approval, but if you have a very solid program, you will probably come across offers along the way for any acquisition or licensing deals.
Yeah, and this is an area where we see a great deal of diversity among the companies that come to us for assistance. One type of company is just interested in increasing the value of their product until they can sell their product to an interested party. These companies tend to flame out more often than not because they are always trying to cut costs in order to get further down the road, whereas companies that take a long-term approach to marketing approval are much more likely to add value to their product and attract investors and buyers due to the thoroughness of their programs.
Exactly, and it's important to have, again, all this information about the planning in the TPP and ITDP because it will help you identify what really differentiates you from the competition. Now, in order to summarize, I want to summarize what we presented to you this afternoon. The most important thing that I would like to emphasize is you need to build a strong, experienced team. And this team is going to help you drive your development program and provide you strategies along the way. Additionally, it's important to develop your strategic development plans, your TPP and ITDP, and these are going to help you tremendously not only to interact with regulatory agencies, but with all your stakeholders. And with that, we appreciate your time. Thank you for your attention, and we are happy to take any questions.
Sheila, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the Q&A. Just a reminder, there's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We already have a lot of great questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So the first one is, get to it, does a CRO company like Roe undertake preclinical phase 1 to phase 3 drug development activities to their clients?
Yes, a CRO, not all CROs do this, but some CROs are focused on product development versus being focused exclusively on clinical development. So typically a company would come to us. We have toxicologists on staff who would advise the client in terms of studies that had been done, needed to be done prior to submitting their IND. I mean, this is part of the total package that small companies need, and I think more and more CROs are evolving from purely clinical research organizations to contract research organizations where they can provide the gamut of services that small companies need. And we do not have a toxicology lab that we are affiliated with. We think it's better to have relationships with a number of contract toxicology laboratories that we can evaluate, audit, and get costs from before recommending one to a client.
What are some lessons learned that you can share from companies who did not create these development plans or who did not use them effectively?
Boy, that's the rule rather than the exception, to be honest with you. Companies do studies that are not required because some champion within the company has a vested interest in some esoteric indication that they think their product might be effective in. They end up seeing adverse events that they would never have seen otherwise if they hadn't gone off track and started exploring alternative indications. I remember one product that was an orphan product, and the company was not satisfied with an orphan market. They wanted a big market, so they examined about 10 different indications, none of which were effective, whereas it turned out that this product was a clotting factor, and they could have done a very minimal program in hemophilia and gotten approved and been on the market, and they wasted, I would say, half a dozen years exploring other indications.
Yeah, I think another issue or lesson learned that we've seen in the past too is some small companies have a lot of great ideas, and sometimes they try to do too much at once. I think one of the recommendations that we have is to try to focus, choose an indication, choose a product that you want to push forward, that you want to utilize your limited resources on, so that you don't end up, diversifying your efforts and spending too much money in too many different places. It can lead to, losing focus, and sometimes can lead you to fail or run out of money before you successfully are able to market a product.
How can a small to medium-sized biotech bounce back from a failed clinical trial?
An infusion of cash is always nice because that allows you to evaluate what went wrong. The first thing you've got to do is determine what went wrong, and many times it's an inadequate phase 2 program. There was not enough work done in phase 2. Phase 2 I see as exploratory. The whole phase is convincing yourself that you have a product. So a failed trial in phase 2 is really expected in some cases because you're doing experiments to determine the best use of your product. What is really difficult to bounce back from is a failed phase 3 trial that was designed inadequately because not enough information was gathered in phase 2 to design a trial that is optimized for success.
Can you shed any light on biosimilar clinical development, especially as it relates to interchangeability, for example, crossover study strategy?
I can't shed a whole lot of light because not a whole lot has been done. Not a whole lot has been written in terms of guidance that would help individuals developing biosimilars in the U.S. It's much further behind development of biosimilars in Europe. And I think it was just a knee-jerk reaction by Congress to enact this law, and the science is nowhere near where the legislatures thought it was. So biosimilars right now are being approved on the basis of the totality of evidence, which includes, the safest thing for FDA is to approve a product that has been in millions of people in Europe. And I think until we get a better handle on what makes a compound interchangeable by assessing chemical properties of the compound, and I don't think that's going to happen in the next 10 years. I think interchangeability is a non-starter.
If our company has a platform technology that can be used in many indications, how can you best choose the first indication to go with? Would more than one indication be recommended?
Yeah, so, we talked a little bit about this, one of the earlier questions, but, certainly you could potentially look at multiple indications, but we would recommend focusing on one initially. One that you think might be the most successful would be optimal, one that's going to get you to market hopefully faster, have more market potential for your product, would be recommended to focus your resources there. And then once you do have that product approved for, a certain indication, you can then, submit a supplemental application to expand that market potential to other indications. look to tweak the formulation to be more optimal in other target populations. But, focusing, I think, initially on one indication is preferred.
For a small company, what document should be the first one to be developed, the TPP or the IPDP?
So we would recommend focusing on the TPP initially before embarking on the IPDP. We talked a little bit about, how the target product profile will feed into the development of the integrated product development plan, which will go into much more detail on the development plans for each discipline within your program. But both are important and valuable strategic documents. And so, if you need to choose one, we would recommend starting with the TPP, but both are extremely valuable and will help you throughout the development program.
When is the right time to schedule a meeting with the FDA?
Well, if you're talking about, let's start with the pre-IND meeting. Our philosophy is to schedule your pre-IND meeting about 2 months before you're planning on submitting your IND. That requires you to really have a good handle on the studies that you're going to submit into your IND. You don't want to go to FDA for advice. You want to go to FDA for them to critique and to change or tweak your plan. So unless it's a very, very novel compound, there are enough experts out in the industry who can tell you how to design a toxicology program, can tell you how your product needs to be manufactured. The CMC portion of the IND, while it's responsible for most clinical holds, really doesn't have to be that detailed. It's only about, less than 20 pages, the CMC, but you've got to know, you have to have a feeling for what the specifications are that FDA is going to want to see around the manufacture of your product. So you have to access the experts in order to put together a well-written briefing document that allows you to go in, and while you're constructing that briefing document, you're actually constructing your IND. So it all flows, and you go to FDA, they tweak a few things, and then 2 months later you turn around and submit your IND.
In small companies, the CEO and the founder are often the same person. What is your advice to a founder CEO with no experience bringing a product to market?
Get out of the way and hire a CEO.
That makes it easy. This looks like this is going to be our final question. I'd like to remind, we had a lot of great questions today. Remind you that we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally for questions that we were not able to get to. So for the final question is, what does a small company need to have to be considered for buyout by a bigger company?
That's a very complex question. It really depends on the match with the large company, you must have done your due diligence on the larger company. Where does your product fit into their product line? What are their desires for the future, for their line? And where would your product fit in the future? That's the number one, I think, question that is in the mind of the people from large pharma that are doing due diligence on small companies. And then the last point I would make is to do the work that's required to validate their due diligence. If you are just running on chewing gum and string, their due diligence is going to absolutely destroy you, because they're looking for solid data. They're looking for, in your data room, all the documentation to convince them that you're manufacturing your product reproducibly within the specifications, and the science that you've done is able to be backed up from a number of different perspectives, not just one publication in the literature.
David, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting the webinar. The webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.